Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Cyber Risk Engineering. We're going to be talking a little bit about ISO 27002, the latest edition that was released this year in February 15th of 2022. That's a mouthful. And with us today to help us just navigate the space, a very experienced auditor, and not just a lead auditor for ISO, but a cybersecurity professional from Croatia, Biljana Cerin. Biljana, welcome.
Hi, Janice, and thank you for invitation to participate in this event. And I'm really happy to share my experience around ISO.
Thank you for being here. So, Biljana, tell us a little bit about you.
All right, so I've been in information security field since I first time heard about that, and that was back in my almost high school days. And graduating from the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Cybercomputing in Zagreb, I started working for Ericsson in Croatia as a software developer, and that kept my interest for about 3 years. After which I decided to move a little bit more on the process and risk management and compliance side of the information security space. And my first engagement with standards in information security was actually with the Health Level 7 protocol for primary healthcare systems, which I found very interesting. And just about that time, I actually, for the first time, so-called BS 7799.2,
Yes.
which is now ISO 27001, which we all love so much. And of course, ISO 17799 at that time. And back in 2004, 2005, as Croatia was establishing all those, I would say, laws in accordance with the European Union and everything else, I actually pushed the Croatian standardization body at that time to adopt those two standards as the first among, I think, 800 standards that they were supposed to adopt as Croatian national standards. So I consider that my first, real passionate engagement with ISO.
And achievement, right? That must
Achievement,
have took
actually.
some doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it really was, when you work with those standardization bodies, they need a lot of justification and explanation why it's important, why these two standards are ahead of everything else and so on. I could explain it to them because at the same time we had the new information security law brought in Croatia in 2005. So we had a number of companies that had to align with it. And you cannot put a standard requirement into a law, but it was mentioned there. Like this is a good information security practice. And then in 2007, 2008, all those other information security requirements were slowly coming up related to financial institutions and Basel II, Solvency II. So my projects at that time were focused around helping banks and insurance companies comply, and also almost all major telecoms in Croatia. And at around 2011, I got more and more interested from the companies in the United States who were actually looking, I would say, at the brightest side of information security, because I personally don't like information security which is driven by compliance or requirements that come from those different standards. Although it's great to have them because they usually serve as a great push when you have to do something. So,
and there's a balance between compliance and standardization, and some of the stuff, you shall be secure. It's like, okay, great, wonderful. How do we do that?
Anyways, I really liked my US clients because I saw these were the companies that wanted to be secure. Okay, they took the standards and compliance requirements into account, but they really wanted to see what's the exposure to information security risks and how to deal with them when placing their products in the market, doing researches, improving their business operations and similar. And so my company, Ostendo Consulting, is still focused on these markets, although we had not so short comeback to the Adriatic region with GDPR.
Yes, 2018, the May of that year, and the build up to GDPR as well, right?
Actually, I think we were quite successful in that area because our first client came from Germany. And they were getting ready for GDPR back in 2016. And no one was talking about GDPR in this region until late 2017 when they figured out, okay, this is really something we have to do, or we are going to get, punished and all that scary story around GDPR. And yeah, most of the clients that I worked with at that time also wanted ISO 27001 implementation because they saw it as a good choice, since we gotta get serious about personal data, but we also, personal data is in the same systems, in the same processes, almost always used as any other sensitive information. So why not take a little bit more of an action approach? So again, exposure to ISO 27001. And when the COVID started, I actually started working more remotely, and my market again changed a little bit. We still have the big companies coming from the US, but more and more those companies that are startups that are now growing fast, and they have big clients who want them to be, I would say, not really compliant, but to show that they manage information security well.
Correct. Yeah.
I felt a little bit sorry for these guys because what was happening to them was they were getting those huge questionnaires with 300 questions around how you manage information security, what controls do you have, and they were so scared. And whenever clients said something like, do you have ISO 27001? Yes, we do. And then, okay, we gotta have it. What do we need to do to have it, and so on. And maybe some other standard like NIST, like CIS 20, they just wanna, they're very agile, very propulsive, very, straightforward, market
Yes.
oriented. So they wanna get information security management in the right place. Again, I'm very happy to see, not just because of compliance, but really they want to do the things right.
And I think that they've done a lot of good changes, ISO and IEC, in this revision of the standard. So you would have seen the 2017 version, right? The one before that. You have a lot of experience with ISO. Based on your experience and involvement in living this standard and seeing it applied and all the compliance that comes with it as well, the risk assessments, the risk treatments, and so on, what would you say are the key things that captivated your attention for this revision of ISO 27002?
So I was hoping to see it much earlier because it's been almost a decade since the last actual revision. I was the whole time I was wondering how come the information security, cybersecurity, technology space is changing so fast, but we still do not have the new version of the standard published. So I was really, happy when it finally came out, and my first reaction was like, oh, finally! So what were you waiting for? And then I was looking to see how they are going to align these really privacy related controls with whatever was happening with ISO before, because you could hear we are going to publish a new privacy management system standard, and you have them, of course. And I was really like, okay, so privacy is now very important. We have information security. We have the standard that used to regulate it quite well. So are they going to dig into the privacy space as well? And surprised to see, yes, they did. They decided to embrace the privacy a little bit more, put a little bit more emphasis on the privacy
Indeed,
side.
there is that emphasis. And also there's the separate ISO privacy standards and other standards on privacy. I think GDPR has been good to us there because it set the tone around that. So we talked a little bit about, when you started engaging and what companies you've engaged with, not only in Croatia, in Europe, and also internationally. Why have you been involved with ISO? What do I mean by that? So there were a lot of people that I know that know of ISO, but decided not to take a career that involves being involved with that, either being an auditor, lead auditor, being involved with the actual processes that ISO and IEC have. What has been your motivation behind that, Biljana?
Because I saw a common sense in that. Whenever you talk about ISO, especially if you had a lot of exposure to different ISO standards of other nature, like quality management, environmental management, and so on, most people get some kind of feeling, it's a bunch of documentation, it's gonna overwhelm us, it's, a nonsense, no one is gonna keep it alive. It is only going to be maybe useful when some client wants it. We're gonna get ready for the audit, like 2 weeks before the audit, and then after the audit, everything back to normal. But this is not the intention. This is not the way ISO should be implemented. And I saw that it can be implemented to completely align with your business processes as it should, to use the tools that you already have in your organization,
Yes.
not use it as an excuse to buy some new tools, not to complicate things. I really saw a common sense behind ISO. I didn't see the bunch of documentation. I'm always proud to say most of the systems that we implement much more than maybe 15 documents as such, as they talk about policies, procedures, and that kind, because it's supposed to be integrated in your system. It's not supposed to be written on the paper, and then no one is going to read these papers anyways. There are a couple of mandatory documents that you need to have, but that's not the point of,
Correct.
working
It's
with
more
ISO.
than documentation, absolutely. And I think that's the value add. I see organizations over and over again seeing like the management review meeting as one example as an overhead, where
Yeah.
actually they're doing it as part of regular cadence. And it's about explaining that you're basically doing this already every 6 months or a year. You will have a formal iteration of it. Yeah, indeed, that makes sense. And I think that there's a lot of motivation in ISO to allow you as an organization to define, right, the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, and the scope of it and what it entails. And that by some is seen as powerful, by others is seen as not prescriptive compared to, NIST that you mentioned, or the CIS top 18 now control, what used to be the CIS 20. They keep changing. That makes perfect sense in terms of your motivation with ISO. So, 10 years since we last saw a revisit of the controls. What was your first reaction when you looked at this standard?
I think it's more useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the attributes. At first, I saw the attributes of the controls, then I was, oh my gosh, wow, they complicated it so much. But then I remembered all my US clients, and they were so, just the last one I was working with, they had ISO, and then they wanted to go back to NIST. And then they wanted to align all those ISO policies with the NIST ones, and then it was like a nightmare, I mean, they had too many policies anyways. But I kind of liked the practicality of the new standard.
Yes.
I like the way the controls from the previous version are merged in the new ones. And I like the new controls, of course, that they added. So this is my first reaction was, okay, this is going to be useful, practical. I think my clients are going to like it. And I should get ready to help them align, although they will have enough time, once the 27001 comes out into a new revision, they
Yes.
will have enough time to comply. But let's start now. Let's see what these new controls are about. Are going to be able to include them, or you're going to have a good justification not to include them? Let's talk about these new controls. This is something I like.
I'll tell you a funny story before we dive into the detail of the control sections, which is a true story for me. So I think it was the 15th of February, which was a Tuesday, and I actually found out about the publication on the ISO website. I knew it was coming. I didn't know the date, right? Through a threat intelligence feed. So at Caberna, we subscribe to a number of feeds. We do a number of feeds for, our clients, all that lovely stuff that involves threat intel, right? And the top line that came through was new version of ISO 27002 has been released. From the 114 controls, we're down to 93. Full stop. That was it. And I thought, it's just like first thing in the morning, you see that and you go, what happened to the rest of them, right? And then, of course, I looked up, as you said, right, the merger of the controls, and we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. So before we go into slides and the presentation that you have for us, Biljana, just to say to our audience, please feel free to chat any questions in our chat channel. You can also find us on Twitter, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, most of the social media if you want to leave a question there, or send us an email with any specific questions that you might have. We plan to run here for 45 minutes, as we typically do, and then allow 15 minutes for a Q&A session towards the end. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or otherwise contact us on social media. With that in mind, Biljana, over to you. We have a lovely presentation for our audience to dive into the detail a little bit of the 4 control sections and the 93 controls. What do you have for us here on the slides? What's this presentation going to be about?
So the presentation is going to cover the changes that I find like the most important ones to discuss, and my thoughts around some of the new controls as well, and a couple of those practical implementation tips at the end that we will discuss in more detail. So can you see my presentation?
We can indeed. Okay.
So the title, what has changed? The title itself, as I told you, has so those 3 things: information security, cybersecurity, and privacy protection, information security controls. It used to be information technology, security techniques, code of practice for information security controls. So we would say this is like a significant change. And I see like it, maybe it's a funny association, but I see it like Bosnia trying to put 3 different entities in peace: information security, cybersecurity, and privacy. And I was like thinking, okay, so how did they do that? And is it all in there? And are they even able to, just put this as one framework that is going to keep everything together? And my impression, yes, they were pretty successful. So I think this is a big advancement. And
what makes you say that? Often, and let me just qualify the question. Often when I see, and this also was an important point when I looked at the title as well. And okay, information security, cybersecurity, we can argue that cybersecurity is a specific area of information security, without getting theoretical, fine. And then privacy protection was difficult, right? How does that fit in? And that was a little bit of a kind of, okay, and privacy, but ISO has its own standards on privacy. So what's going on here? What did you make of that?
So I see it as a intent to actually, when GDPR started, we had this constant struggle around data protection as a term. I don't know if you were involved in this. And then you had the legal people saying, data protection is not about IT. This is not what is meant by data protection. Data protection is a pure legal term, and we are talking about individual rights and so on. So this is data protection. And then you go and look at the other side of the whole story and us IT experts, and we see data protection is something different, something dealing more with actually cybersecurity, information security. We are both right. It's, in my opinion, it's the both words that need to come together. Only in that way we can actually implement privacy mechanisms as they should be implemented, both from the technological and organizational and legal side. And as I often say in my projects, when I talk to my clients, most of the times I just feel like a translator talking to 3 different kind of people. One of them are my colleagues from IT and cybersecurity experts. The other ones are my colleagues from legal, and the third ones are business people. I just feel like I'm somewhere in the middle and trying to make them all understand each other. So I think
the mediator, right? Trying to bring the 3 together. Yeah, that's very true. Exactly. Indeed. So you think overall ISO has been successful in this iteration of the controls, because we're talking about 27002, in terms of encompassing all those 3 aspects you said?
Yes, I think they've been successful. There are a couple of things that I will talk about, which I think maybe could have been done a little bit better, but I understand the reasoning behind it. So I think they did the best they could. So
And we have our first question on this that actually is a little bit critical of including privacy, but we'll come to that later on. Okay, so the title has changed, but that's okay. What else?
we can live with that, right?
We can live with
The
that. Yeah.
next the next big thing that changed, and now I'm going back in my memory all the way to somewhere
Assets,
to
assets,
2000.
assets.
You know how much trouble this was giving people. Like, how many mouses do we have? How many laptops? How many, okay, let's say smarter things like databases, servers, and all of that. And remembering those, even in the previous revision, not the 2013, but just 2005, it was all around assets. And then, if you remember those exercises, especially in large organizations, when they were trying to identify risks to all the assets, and you
Yes.
would get like
Enumerate
endless.
every asset, right? Like the headphones and like every single asset. Oh, that's an asset. Is it in our inventory? That was mad.
That, I mean, then with the standards revision in 2013, that already changed as an approach to risk assessment, but still they had that clumsy assets associated with information processing facilities, organizations assets, information assets that was the most confusing term. People were simply confused, like what is meant by this? And now they finally put the statement that I think is really correct. It's about information and other associated assets. Now we are having a much clearer picture. We, when you go in the standard and see, what's it all about, they actually divided it into sections: primary and supporting assets. So
Correct.
primary assets are information, business processes, and activities. So this is what we are trying to protect, right? And then supporting, on which the primary assets rely: hardware, software, network, personnel, site, organization, structure. That's the right division. That's how it should be. And I think this really avoid all that. I would say it's mostly time consuming and exercise, and the approach to asset-based risk assessment, I think, should finally go away. That's my opinion. I
And
think
it's
it's really
something that is happening also in other international standards. So if I look at the
exactly.
resilience standards, they talk about services, right? They talk about processes supporting revenue streams or business processes. So I think it's about time that in the information security world, we step out of the mouse,
Mhm.
right, or the SASE of the server, especially because we're all about a SaaS-based kind of model of consumption when it comes to any of the information assets that we have. So that, yeah, absolutely, I think it makes sense. Question to you, Biljana, do you think they would have it would have been good to push further in the definition of primary assets, i.e., talk more about service lines and not stop at the business process level?
And maybe it will be useful as we go more, as you said, into service-oriented world. But I think this is already a huge step forward. And under the business processes and activities, you can actually have all of those.
True.
For the big first step, all of those services and everything else, you can have them covered in here.
Mhm.
But I think this is really a good change, and the first one I noticed and actually was looking forward to. And then, as I said, information security specific risk assessment is something that was also changed. In the old standard, it was like we should identify requirements through a risk assessment, threats to assets that are identified, and vulnerabilities, and so on. I think when we talk about information security specific risk assessment, as the new standard is now talking about, it brings us, a much clearer picture of what we are supposed to do. Because now you have, information security risk management as part of enterprise risk management as such, and then you have different reporting lines and different people identified as risk owners and so on. I think it's really, can you perform information security risk assessment yes, but let's make sure what it actually is. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I got a request from a bank. They want IT risk assessment and information security risk assessment and cybersecurity risk assessment as well. And I was asking them, so what do you want? What exactly are you talking about? So it's just, sometimes the terminology is so difficult that it prevents people from doing the right thing. And they
Correct. Yeah.
see a request. Probably this request was coming from probably some kind of a due diligence activity or screening of a company, or maybe external auditors of whatever type, although, in financial world, it's pretty well regulated. But I guess this was coming from some other story. And sometimes people don't know what to do. And then I figured out they actually hired 3 different companies to do those 3 different risk assessments. Why?
Really? Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the only one missing was data privacy as well, right? They might have well
exactly.
thrown
And
that in there.
that was my question. Like, what about privacy? Which part of them is actually related to privacy? So I think terminology section is really important. And in the new standard, I couldn't copy the standard here. You can all buy standard, and they put the links to the terminology websites of ISO, and they actually defined pretty many terms in ISO 27002
Yes,
itself.
that's
Yeah,
one of
before
the
that,
good things of
yeah, I
ISO,
think
right?
it's
You have the
yeah.
definitions. Yeah, indeed.
It's really, when you're so long in the field and when you still think, oh my gosh, we're still arguing about terminology. But that's what it is, because we have to accept new people are coming into the field. Maybe they didn't have a chance to understand everything. Maybe they didn't learn about that at the college or whatever, you know, education they took. Yes, terminology is important, and let's clarify terminology. Let's clarify what we're talking about. So I
So
think
that's
it's a
good.
good thing.
We have the information security requirements defined for the specific risk assessment. Really good. What else?
Okay. And now we come to the privacy
Mm,
one.
PII.
At first, I didn't like the PII. I was disappointed. Why are you
Why
guys talking
not?
about PII? Because when you look at the PII in the uh, United States privacy domain with HIPAA, for example,
Mhm.
it was really narrow focused. It's not like personal data as what GDPR defines personal data, but reading in the standard, and here is a copy paste from the standard. So they put a GDPR-like definition, and they said PII is an information that can be used to establish a link between the information and the natural person to whom such information relates. So not just pure identified information, but any information that can be directly or indirectly linked to a natural person, which they call a PII principle. And then when you read in explanation in the new version of the standard, they also say data subject is a synonym to PII
It's a PII
principle
principle. I
that
saw
can be
that
used.
too. Yeah.
So I was like, yes, good job, guys. Finally, it's just, I was really scared when I saw PII. I thought, oh my gosh, this is a huge step back. But then yes, they explained it in the right way. And I guess, it's still an ISO, maybe PII is a little bit more common term, and that's why they use that as such. And then they mentioned those privacy impact assessments and so on, not really using GDPR because GDPR is European thing. But I think people will understand, what it's all about.
Mhm.
So I was happy with this one.
Data subject, indeed. PII principle. There's your first takeaway, everyone, in terms of, well, what it is that has changed in the privacy domain regarding ISO 27002.
Okay. Now, a little bit about the new structure of the standard. I guess you saw those in all those news reports and so on. And as you were shocked on February 15th, only 93 controls. But actually, when you look at the annexes A and B of the standard, you could see that all the previous 114 controls
That's
are
right.
still there. Yeah,
Correct.
they're
Yep.
still there.
They've been merged.
Um,
Yep.
and these are just divided a little bit differently. So we have now organizational, people, physical, and technological control domains. I like it. I think it makes sense.
Much shorter
Um,
compared to the 14 that we
yeah,
had before as control categories, right? Now we have four. I
I think
I
it's
like it too.
a lot of
Yeah.
clarifying the picture a little bit. When you look at the number of controls on organizational controls, that's pretty much actually 37 controls related. But this is what we are talking about all the time. And when you look at the GDPR, they say organizational and technological controls. So this is what should be there. People controls, physical controls, okay, understandable. 93 controls total. But a nice and really useful comparison table at the end of the standard, so it shouldn't be a big problem to you to align it and develop a new statement of applicability and link those controls. It's easy to navigate actually. Then they put something that I see as a redundancy here. They say teams. Controls are categorized as people controls, physical controls, technological controls, or otherwise as organizational. It's pretty much the same as clauses. So okay,
Yes,
but they
indeed.
introduced the themes, which is okay. This is the theme we are going to talk about. And then the biggest change are the attributes. As I told you at the beginning, I was scared, like, are you guys gonna complicate everything now and what's happening? And then all the best around NIST, and many people like NIST because they give you much more detail and instruction answers to how-to questions. But I think the attributes here are very useful, and in the way they are presented, and even in the way they are they put a small hashtag before each one of the attributes so you can easily find them in the standard itself. This is of course intended to be copied in some kind of a tool or something. So we have a control type attributes. So this is something we are all used to, whether a control is preventive, detective, or corrective. Information security properties, good old CIA, still there. Cybersecurity concepts, which is a direct connection with the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Yes.
Identify, detect, respond, recover. And my US colleagues are going to love it. And then operational capabilities set of attributes. That's in my other slide. And security domains, governance and ecosystem, protection, defense, and resilience. This one I think is also important because maybe you notice resilience is coming, I wouldn't say a buzzword, but many vendors use this in last couple of maybe like 2 years.
I
I
hope it
have
doesn't
talked
become
about.
a lost definition, because resilience started off as this real niche, difficult domain. Then it became a little bit more mainstream, standardized, and now everyone is doing it. And I'm not sure, to your point, if everyone is doing it
I
right.
see vendors are using it as a selling point, resilience. We have solutions that are going to help your organization be resilient and so on, which is good, okay, yeah, sure, we want to be resilient. But when you look at the standard itself, it doesn't mention it at really many places. So I think maybe some, work around that should be implemented, but it's good to see it. So, and here is the thing I talked about
The
when I.
alignment to NIST, right? That was
Yeah.
music to my ears when I saw that. That was great.
I don't know why, but people we like ISO, I think, in Europe much more
Yeah.
than people in the States. I don't know why. I see many more companies are actually now adopting ISO, but it was really a slow and long process. And
Yes.
yeah, of course they have NIST, but this is still international standard, and I think they should see it as useful as well. But since we do have NIST over there, I'm happy to see the alignment and this section that will help you, whatever you did with your NIST cybersecurity controls framework, and whenever if you plan or not. If you plan to align with ISO 27001 requirements, this is definitely going to help you when you search through the controls. When I have those extensive controls assessment exercises, and then clients are looking for reports, and this is something that reports should be structured in this way for this type of audience, in some different way from some other type of audience. This way helps.
Indeed, the crosswalk between ISO, NIST, any other standard, right? And just being
Any
able
other.
to map between the two, but actually not do the mapping by yourself. Have the mapping because the attributes are included in the standard, right? I've
Yeah.
witnessed so many discussions, Biljana, and I'm sure you have as well, whereby you have one person arguing that this control, is a prevent control, well, it should be a detect, this, that, where does it belong? No, it belongs to this category. Actually, no, you're not compliance-wise in this section, right? Now, all those conversations and, the cottage industry consultancies supporting them go away because you have that in an attribute section for each control linking the two. And I think it would be great to see more of that, right? If there's
Exactly.
other standards that we need to cross-pollinate with and just have that marriage in terms of crosswalks. And for those who don't know what a crosswalk is, so you take the two standards, you put a matrix, you have columns on NIST, for example, and rows on ISO. This is controls, right? Not clauses, very granular. And you say, okay, where do they map, right? And that output, that matrix, is basically your crosswalk that then allows you to do effectively a review in another standard, given that you've achieved one more.
Yeah.
Uh,
And sorry.
So, operational capabilities attribute. So
Yeah.
what
So
what is
these
this?
a number of attributes that are under that section, operation capabilities, but you can actually see it's pretty much all of them are kind of operational capabilities. This is your security operations, something that you're supposed to do every day, take care of, I don't know, secure configurations, identity and access management, threat and vulnerability management, and so on. So these are just attributes that are linked to the operation capabilities.
Right.
And I think it's also, just as you just said, something very useful. To me, it's sometimes strange when I see why organizations spend so much time in mapping those standards. And we didn't even mention like COVID. We have ISO, we have NIST, we have CIS, we have controls in different regulations and so on. All those mappings should be actually given and free, and in most cases they are. Just
Correct.
maybe a message to my consulting colleagues: don't charge your clients for mappings. It's just something that is already there. Give it to them. They don't have time to look for that, but it's all available, and it just makes sense, as you said. So it's just something useful, and with this new ISO 27002, it really shouldn't give you a lot of headache, and especially if you have the ability to adjust your tools that you're using, put those attributes in there, and see what you get. It should be easy, straightforward. Don't spend too much time on that.
Mhm.
Okay, exactly what I was just saying, like how to use those attributes. ISO 27002 also said, this is our proposal of the attributes. You can add some of them if you want to, put some different attributes that are relevant to your environment.
Correct. You can delete
Yeah,
them. You can. It's a
you
little
can
bit
delete them.
like, when Microsoft used to put examples of code in C++ for specific things, right? And then those examples became the default, basically, that everyone used. With ISO, again, yes, of course, attributes can be added and removed, and it's great that we have an encouragement that each organization does that. But actually, we're probably going to see the attributes just become the norm. The ones that are already included just
Yeah,
become the norm.
that's a problem with the so-called checklist approach. Once you put something into a checklist, no one is actually trying to change it much. They
Yes.
just stick to what's already in the checklist. But yeah, it should be a little bit more imaginative and innovative and adjustable to your environment. And this is what ISO said. We are going to stick to that. No, come on, guys. Look at your real environment. See, maybe this doesn't make sense for you. Maybe you are missing something that is important, and put that in there. So common sense. I always say, just use your common sense. Um, Again, if you have to navigate controls, relations to events, to the risk scenarios, to the risk treatment plans, compliance requirements, all of this can be, done easily with the attributes. And then the question comes with the tools. I don't know, GRC tool, wherever I come, I see a GRC tool, but I never see it's fully and completely used.
Yes, very
Somehow,
true, right? Either the risk assessment is done in it and then the risk treatment is somewhere else.
yes.
The appetite is kind of like a board thing and the risk assessment is somewhere else. But I've never seen, and there's so many GRC tools out there, right? And there's some of them are so expensive, some of them are free, some of them are so expensive, and they've got all these little modules. If we can do something to just homogenize a little bit, ultimately it's a threat that's hitting a control, and there's a residual, right, risk, and there's, it's pretty simple, right? And you have a framework on it. I'd love to see people streamline their GRC tools based on what ISO 27002 has done.
At least in this domain. And the worst thing I could see is when someone has an expensive GRC tool and then spreadsheets, number of spreadsheets all around the place.
Yes.
So why do you have your GRC tool for then? And then, reporting. Okay, these GRC tools are supposed to have great reporting capabilities and you should be able to use them. But still, those people import data from the tools in some other
The number of Excels exported, yes. And then the poor guys cutting PowerPoint out of that, and then the format. That's the reason why you have the tool, right? Yeah, absolutely.
So again, a useful mechanism also is now giving you use those attributes, adjust it to your environment, implement it in the tools that you're using, provide reports to the different audiences. I think it's really, a useful thing.
Well, one thing that I wanted to ask you, Biljana, in your experience, have you seen any tools that you don't have to name them, but have you seen any tools have the new 27002 control set already in them?
No.
Me neither.
Not at the clients that I'm working with right now. But I suppose they're gonna be out very, very soon. I think it's a big change and they should really implement that soon. All right. Control layout in the new standard. So you have the control title, attribute table, which is a big change. You didn't have it before.
Yes.
The control itself, which you had, the purpose, which you didn't, the guidance, which you had, and other information which is useful. So I like it. I think it's much more like on how to, and with a lot of examples, which I also like, and common language, not really, something that is difficult to read, but something that's really easy to associate with. So I would say, good job to all those working groups, and I think they made it much more understandable.
What's your favorite from this list of what's in the control layout? And I'll tell you mine afterwards as well.
I always like in the old standard as well, the guidance part, because this is what it's all about, how we should implement that control, but other information as well. So attribute table is useful because you can see all in one place. So I think this is a good structure. So
I would agree with you. The attribute table, right? The attribute table is gold dust because it gives you the ability to have a one-to-many mapping for each control. Right, so that's really important, especially if you start setting your own attributes in custom control environments. And think of preventative controls versus corrective controls versus monitoring controls, right? As one example. The one that I really liked, which I think was kind of a rip-off from some of the other frameworks, was the purpose. I think it was well overdue. Right, and it reminded me of, and you'll remember this, and you'll probably quote the framework back to me, the control objective, right? Which is, well, I don't care what the definition of the control is, it must be able to achieve this, right? So that was good because it gave the end result, and also it helps in incident response when you're doing root cause analysis, right? But if we had this control, then we wouldn't be dealing.
Why did it help? Exactly. So I think it's a nice approach. Good to see. And now
The
the new
new
controls.
controls. Take us through this. Number one on the list, right? Threat intelligence. What's going on here? So this was
But
exciting.
you mentioned that you get the information through the threat intelligence feed. So is the new ISO considered a threat or what?
Well, it was quoting threat intelligence, right? So of course some AI bot had linked it on Twitter on whatever threat intelligence feed, and you know what Twitter is like you get like 3 retweets from bots, then you're famous, right, for 1 minute when it comes to hashtag cybersecurity or something like that. And I think, right, I'm speculating, I think it was because one of the new control categories, as you say here, the number one, is threat intelligence, right? And that's what created the linkage, i.e. someone was talking about threat intelligence. Now, all this is speculation, of
It
course,
is.
but it did come across on a threat intelligence feed, which I found amusing. Tell us a little bit about the new controls here. So are we expecting organizations to have to do big investments to meet ISO 27002 requirements compared to the previous version when the grace period of 1-2 years is over? Is this going to be a lot of work in your opinion?
A couple of them give me that question and a little bit of headache, but I think you can, always adjust what the control is saying. You need to find a justification for the exclusion of control if you don't really need it, if your risk is not such that it requires the control. But most of these controls are gonna be very difficult to exclude. So let's look at them. So threat intelligence as the first one now tells you you have to monitor those sources of information about threat landscape, whatever is changing for your organization, whatever is changing in wider context, in narrow context. You gotta be monitoring what's happening. You gotta get those sources of information, as something that you are actually using.
Yes, you
So
can't be in your silo, right? You need to be looking out for
you need to be
threats, what
looking
others
out.
are suffering with.
And it's something everybody is talking about these days because of the situation we are all in, and everyone is asking, are we exposed to these threats? And then how interesting or attractive we are, that kind of stuff. You need to understand your organization and see the market, the environment it's operating in, and actually, take a look at the threats. The standard itself suggests help from organization outside, like yours, like Berna, like other sources of information that are really working in this field and gathering this intelligence that can present it to you. The next one is quite something that it's new, but when you look at cloud services providers, I would put them as any other third-party provider. And all the controls that you put in place around your third parties, but in this one it's a little bit better described, like what you should look at and how you should kind of
You know what this one reminded me of when I read it? It reminded me of one of the OWASP top 10 of all things around insecure configuration.
we had that one down, the configuration management, number 5.
But then it was, yeah, exactly. But then there was a separate one on configuration management. And here's where we've got something overlapping, but I think showing the importance of cloud, right? That it's something that we have a new control on.
I like this emphasis that they put in there. If you are seizing your relationship with the cloud services provider, how you're supposed to do that, what risks could be in place and so on. So I think this is a good one, a useful one, especially for those organizations that are still kind of hesitant towards clouds. It's in there, if you are using cloud services, you got to implement the control that actually helps you mitigate the risks associated with that. So it's no longer some kind of, unusual. I think everyone is using cloud services today.
What's
The
number
third
3?
one, ICT readiness for business continuity. If you remember in the previous version of the standard, that was another clumsy statement. You had information security continuity. And then people would say, we have another standard for business continuity, and ISO 27001 has nothing to do with business continuity. No.
Those were funny dialogues, right?
But
Especially if
the
you're the lead
wording
auditor. It's like,
the wording was definitely strange in the previous version, and the wording now is much better. They're actually asking you to do the business impact assessment to really define what your RTO and RPO are, And this control is now much more clear. So good job on that one. Physical security monitoring, I think all the organizations have already implemented that, but they say it's a new control because you have to monitor your physical locations and spaces and so on. Maybe it wasn't so
There was a lot of
directly.
focus on preventive controls, and now it's good to see that monitor sort of evolution of it. But you're right, it's not completely new. Yeah, indeed.
Configuration management, again, is something you should take really good care of and really well described on what is meant by all of that. Configuration management in all domains, in software and whatever, off the shelf that you are using, your own that you are developing, whatever tools you have, you have to make sure that someone is taking care of the good configuration management. Information deletion, data masking, these are directly related to privacy. And they mention, legal contractual requirement and how you should delete your information. If you are using third parties to do that, how they should do that, and so on. Data masking as well. If these are highly sensitive information, you should use anonymization, pseudonymization, or encryption techniques. So what will be your excuse not to implement this control? Again, a huge opportunity for different vendors in this space.
And great to see actually data masking being included, right? Because I mean, the number of times you would have to fight data masking in the domain of secure development lifecycle, separation of UAT from production data, and similar. But now you have a data masking control, right? So clear.
Coming back to your question about costs, data leakage prevention, this one can be really expensive if you go with the data loss prevention tools, because that implementing that control actually requires you to really put your classification policy in place, implement all those classification requirements, define the processes on how your information travels through the company, what is supposed to go which way, which is not supposed, who's supposed to see that. I see this one may be expensive. And there are workarounds, awareness, education, some kind of monitoring mechanisms and so on that are not necessarily the expensive DLP tools, but the easiest way to deal with that is actually through a DLP tool. So this may introduce a little bit more cost.
Yes.
Monitoring activities, again, tools, but I think most of the organizations already have the tools that monitor activities and the networks and the user behavior and so on. And also the same thing as with data leakage prevention, the standards warns you about privacy issues when implementing these controls. So that's a good thing also, for the practitioners to make sure they don't do anything that is privacy too intrusive, that they let the people know what's happening, that they are being monitored, and that the way they use information systems are actually known to the organization. Web filtering, what services you should use, what services you shouldn't use, how to recognize them, what policies should be put in place. And then the secure coding, which we always looked at, and you mentioned the OWASP and so on, and it was always a part, of the secure software development life cycle and
Correct.
this
Yeah.
set of controls. However, now it's like a new control, and it tells you secure coding should be always applied, not only with the development of new software, but also when you change your software and what kind of practices should be in there. And I think my impression that most of these breaches that we have nowadays and like privacy, those reports coming from data protection authorities and so on. I think that secure coding is really an area that we are not very good at.
Agreed. Agreed.
Not to blame anyone, because I understand, companies that develop software, they want to do it quickly. They are using good methodologies. They are using skilled developers. They really take care of who is the senior in the company, who is the junior, how it all works together, and deployment, control of the software and so on. But I still think the security of it. I liked when people were talking about, development, security operations, like DevSecOps. And I thought something is going to change when that was kind of a buzzword, but it didn't go really that way. So,
And I think you need, you're absolutely right, Biljana, right? And I think you need organizations to get a better understanding of what development is instead of treating it like a black box. I mean, we did have
exactly.
the controls on secure development of code in the previous version of ISO.
And now with this one, the way I see it, when I look at, let's say young companies, young people, they need to take care of security. When you are developing your code, make sure you implement those secure coding mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always a question like, who is going to do that? And how many sprint calls do we need to have in order to make sure it's happening? How important is that? It is really important. You should do that. But we need to keep repeating this message because this is where the breaches happen.
Indeed, and also take ownership of it, right? So it'd be good for the head developer to take on and be the owner of secure coding as a control, right?
Maybe the head developer, maybe it will be a team member that
maybe
really
it's a
is
separate,
into security.
or maybe exactly, but have that momentum around it. Shall we take a couple of questions on this slide? We've got 2 questions that have come in on this. We haven't forgotten the previous 2 questions that we have. First question, I think it's on physical security monitoring. Does monitoring also include reacting on events?
Of course, because what's the point of monitoring if you do not react to the events? So yeah, it should be both preventive control, as it said, also reactive. So someone should get those monitoring reports and be able to react if something happens. I guess we do not want to go back to that story on, working hours, out of work hours stuff and that kind of issues. And you can always use third parties, that will help you. But yes, this is the point of the security monitoring.
Indeed, and I would just add to that you only have you also have the ability to add to your risk assessment risks that are coming out of your event monitoring, be it physical incidents or similar. And that's often a cycle that's forgotten in ISO, i.e. we do the risk assessment, we do incidents, we do the management review, and then we don't link the 3 together, right? So remember to do that. Second question on secure coding. Do we think secure coding is required as a new control given the categories that we simply had in the 2017 version? What do you think?
So for any of the controls in ISO, actually 27001 Annex A, which are going to be these controls that we are now talking, when it finally changes, it's supposed to change in somewhere during this year. You have to have the justification on why you want to exclude some control. So if you want to exclude secure coding from your controls, you need to tell yourself and your auditors, of course, why you excluded that. Why do you think secure coding is not necessary for you? And I don't believe you're going to have a good excuse.
Yes, and if you're writing code, the only example that I can think of where those controls have been excluded is where you're not writing, exactly, you're not writing in-house code, but you still have the control that's for controlling the code that is given to you, right? Yeah. Yes, good point. Thank you for that, Biljana. Okay, so those are the new controls as a summary. We're just on top of the hour. We're going to go into implementation tips. Please note, everyone, we're taking questions as we go along. So, implementation top tips. Over to you, Biljana Cerin.
As I already said, the first thing I would like all of you to look at when you are looking at the new controls and the new version of the standard, and if you are already certified towards ISO, You will have enough time, but make sure all of these controls, as the question was around secure coding, do we have to have them? If we think that we do not, then let's make sure we have a clear explanation why not. We don't develop our software and so on. We don't have our offices, we all work remotely, whatever, whatever control you do think you can exclude. Make sure you understand your requirements. And I would say, even though I consider myself a little bit of an old timer, but I would say be agile. I didn't, if you would ask me like 5 years ago, would I ever recommend being agile in ISO world? I would say, come on, this is not something you do. But I think agility is really important.
How
And
do you mean agility here? Give
for
us an
example,
example.
I had a meeting yesterday with a company that wants to raise a new series of investment. And one of the conditions they have is they need to be compliant with ISO 27001 within next 6 months. And most of the consultants they talked to told them this is impossible. They're not a big company. And I implemented ISO 27001 a couple of times in much, much bigger companies within 6 months, but only with the strong management support and with the ability to adjust.
Yes,
If you
it's a
think
change program,
ISO,
right?
if you think ISO is that important to you, you want to implement ISMS, you want to put the right controls in place, you want to define your processes, roles, and responsibilities, you can do that because it's your new requirement, and you have to adjust, to your business. If this is of utmost importance, you're not going to raise money, you are not going to get clients, or you are not going to treat your risks timely, which should be the most important things to you, then you need to be able to adjust and to actually use that agility in your approach to implementation. Be quick, be responsive, find the right people in the team, hire external consultants if you need to, and make sure you have the right prioritization in place and that you can adjust your business to the ISO as such.
So be agile towards the change that the
I think
controls and ISO will introduce to your organization. That makes sense. Clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Why have
it's
you included
always it's
that?
always it's always the thing. The worst thing. How to be very careful about what I'm saying here. So, if you do not define roles and responsibilities well, people tend to avoid them. And maybe some companies don't like them like formally defined. But the worst thing you can have is, someone is gonna take care of that. Maybe it will be, I don't know, a system admin, but he is not actually, responsible for security, so he shouldn't be doing that. And I will give that to our network admin, and these kind of discussions you don't want when implementing controls. I'm not talking about the new
Absolutely.
ISO. I'm talking about, anytime. Um, the question around, formalized structures, the CISO role, CISO's team, different teams for different domains of controls. Again, be agile. If you don't really need a CISO, yeah, just explain to me who is going to take care of the system, who is going to drive the system forward, who's going to make sure the risks are treated on time, all those implementation activities are done. Whether or not it's a CISO, it's just important to me that I know who is responsible for this part. And always, the question of conflict of interest. Don't forget, maybe I should really write it here. Conflict of interest should be avoided in that. But you need to know who is doing what and when and how
Yes.
and with what resources and so on. So this is always important. Measurement system, this is something I still see lacking. After all these years, most of the companies still measure just the basic things, and these are not adequate measurements. I see often reports like how many incidents did we have, or how many systems did we patch this month, or how many, I don't know, in privacy domain, how many data subject requests we had. And this is not the only thing you should measure. So you should develop a very well-built measurement system around all these controls that are actually focused to measuring the effectiveness of that specific controls or set of controls. Maybe you know how to measure every single one of them, but make sure you measure not only the controls, but the processes around them as well. So let's say risk assessment. How do you do that risk assessment? Is it something continuous, or you do that quarterly, or you do that once a year? And how are you sure that your risk assessment is actually efficient? Do you just do it like for the sake of doing and reporting, or you actually take into account expert opinions, incidents, as you mentioned, now the threat intelligence sources of information, vulnerability assessment results, pen test results. These are the systems that you should incorporate in these measurement mechanisms around the processes and around the controls as well. So I think measurement should be really improved. Only if you measure something, you can improve something. So improvements should be coming back as the results of those measurement activities. I often hear, as I said already, controls testing, controls. Very often it's just another exercise.
A tick of the box exercise, right? Yeah, not with real value. And what I say to people when they say, you know, we don't have enough measuring points, right? We're not that mature as an organization. Well, you probably do. You probably do. You just haven't sat down and thought of objectives to measure in a smart way. And smart is not just smart, clever, but SMART.
ART, exactly. Why do you measure, and what do you expect from that measurement?
Measurable, attainable, all the lovely things that come with that. And there's many ways that you are being measured today at your work, if you think about it, right? And remuneration is one of those. So very important to look at measurement and not just see it as an exercise that goes back into, oh yes, we'll establish some KPIs next year, right? Or as part of our recertification, perhaps. Completely agree there. Improvements. What do you mean here, Biljana?
So improvement, as I said, you can only improve things that you measure. So this is really connected to the measurement system. So, and you are do it to improve your controls and effectiveness of those controls. And also reporting and feedback, you know, and then how all of these controls are really impacting your systems and processes, especially when you take everything into account, you know, the people, the processes, the technology that you implemented. Is it really justified? Are you overcomplicating? In many, especially financial institutions, I see sometimes when people implement controls, they tend to buy everything because they feel insecure if they do not buy the latest, I don't know, super modern, highly respectful Gartner, Forrester, whatever solution.
Yes, the question is really,
you know, is it really necessary in your organization?
Exactly. So, I'm just going to tie this to a question that we had pretty much at the beginning of this meeting. So the question says, when it comes to the DPO reporting to the ISO, reporting to the head of IT, what do you expect the mechanisms to be within an organization? And I think it ties into reporting and feedback here as you've added it, especially in the purchase of a tool. What would you answer to that?
So for the data protection officer, DPO, right?
Yes, for the data protection, the three people, data protection, ISO or information security
CISO,
manager or CISO, right? CISO, and IT manager.
Okay, so I think when you look at the latest opinions from different data protection authorities on reporting and the roles of these people, let's just talk about CISO and DPO because I have a lot of companies have the question around, you know, whether these two roles are in conflict of interest. So we have a strange situation where, I don't know, Croatian Data Protection Authority said basically they are in conflict of interest. And the French one said they are not, the Dutch one said they are not. The correct answer is it's depending on who is making the data processing decisions.
Correct. Goes back to the role and responsibilities, right?
Exactly. If you are as a CISO making data, personal data processing, decisions, then you shouldn't be a DPO, or you could exclude yourself from that area. But bottom line is DPO and CISO can be the same person. Shouldn't be really the conflict of interest if they know exactly what they are doing. And here comes the reporting. If you have a DPO in the company, you have a CISO as well. I think it's not so much about reporting, but collaboration, because
Yes,
DPO
absolutely.
is more, he's concerned, about data subject rights and implementing the privacy management system, right? And, are we not just protect CISO, he looks more at how we are protecting information within the company as such, all information, including personal data, which are highly, regulated, sensitive data, and so on. DPO is taking care of how the legal requirements are met and how the individual rights are met. And if these technological and organizational controls that are protecting all other information are protecting personal information as well. And they should really have close collaboration. IT director, if you are asking me, IT director is the one who is going to implement what they tell him. I know this may sound a little bit let's say brutal, but I always see, IT is a service to the organization. If I identify a risk, I'm CISO, I'm talking about information security risk management. I'm a DPO, I see a risk to the data subjects here. What mechanisms do you have to have in place? What tools are we going to buy to mitigate that risk? Here comes the IT director, and he's telling us, okay, these tools are good, these are not, these are expensive, these are justified, these are something we already have but we are not using, and so on. And it should always be a discussion. And these security
Agreed.
requirements should be driven from these risk-based discussions. So I wouldn't say that much about reporting, but really collaboration, conversation, making decision, implementation.
And there should be no daylight between the three, right? So they should be working in tandem. In fact, one I would argue is providing services to the other. So in your example of a DPO doing perhaps a DPIA or another type of assessment, the CISO is providing services to identify if we've had a breach, has the control been impacted, etc. IT is providing the respective infrastructure and the services that support the normal processes, and the three need to be working in collaboration.
Together.
I might reuse that. Very much enjoyed that answer. Okay, so that's how to implement and a little bit of detail there. What do we have as next steps?
So I would say if you are now in a process of an upcoming internal audit to your ISO 27001, take into account these changes. If your company or business, owners are willing to already talk about the changes in the controls, make sure you involve that into your discussion. So you still do the audit towards the old standard because it's still active, but get ready for the new statement of applicability, see how these controls are merged, get familiar with the new controls, make sure you understand the risks that these controls are supposed to mitigate and whether or not you have the right reason for justification for exclusion of these controls, and get ready for the new statement of applicability, because that's the
Indeed.
most important document of your ISO anyways. So, ensure you have all the sources of information available that you need. I would say I'm waiting. The new ISO 27001 is not supposed to change in the mandatory part. It's just supposed to incorporate the controls from the new ISO 27002. But I would still like to see it, once it becomes published. For all the new controls that require the new sources of information, make sure you have access to them. You mentioned how important it is to have a good source of information around threat intelligence.
One
If you
example.
need, if you need help around, what's secure coding all about, OWASP, get familiar with these, And I would say start early.
My favorite
With
on
it.
this list. Actually start early, right?
I would say now. For example, I have a couple of audits coming up in the next few weeks, and to all of them I said, make sure when we are done with the formal part of the audit, we will discuss the new ISO 27002. Please, take an hour or two of your time, get familiar with that. Let's talk about that because this is something that is going to be very important to you in the upcoming period. So start early, especially if you have a
Start early.
resistance. If you have resistance to changes, then the sooner you start, the better.
Well, start by purchasing the standard if you're ISO certified,
Exactly.
right? That's a really
Exactly.
important point. But from an LA perspective, from a lead auditor perspective, I would very much agree with you there, Biljana, because the most important thing is, leave behind just a blank SOA statement of applicability with the new controls and just say, and this is something for you to think about because it's coming down the line, right? And it ties into starting early, and it ties into actually seeing what that statement looks like, or what the different control categories look like. So very much agree with you there.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that was all from me at this time. I
Thank you.
welcome your
Very
questions now,
insightful.
anytime
So
you want.
we've first of all, thank you again. Very insightful. We've had a couple of questions that we answered along the way. I'm just checking the list to see. Oh yes, and there's one more question that I see here. ISO or NIST, which do you prefer and why?
ISO. I
Okay.
think it's I love NIST, and I understand why most of the people I think love NIST because it gives you much more detailed instructions on how to implement controls. But ISO to me is, I like when they say intended for all organizations, very risk-based, not too prescriptive, which I also like, very common sense, and you can get certified. I said in the beginning, I don't like security driven by compliance, but sometimes that certification really, gives you less headache, especially when talking to your clients and talking to the regulators. It's even recommended in GDPR regulation as a one example, not specific towards ISO, but certification helps. But it
Yeah.
shouldn't be your ultimate goal. Your ultimate goal should be to align your processes and controls to make sure your information security management system is efficient and effective and everyone knows what he's supposed to do. And especially your people. Your people are always the strongest link in your organization if they are educated well and aware, or the weakest if you don't give enough attention to your people.
And it's really about strengthening that bond that you have and getting your organization from the level of maturity that they have now to the next level up. I think sometimes NIST can be daunting there because you go from 5 principles, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right, to 2,000 controls in the 8053 revision 4 document, right? And that can be like, oh, what's going on here? While ISO is just more bite size, and also it involves the engagement of management in the ISMS, which is really good. I, I I would pick ISO for that reason because it just helps organization achieve the next level of maturity. If you are already at a certain level of maturity, then probably NIST and more advanced standards. For example, NIST is now working on, and we have to be specific with what standards of NIST we refer to as the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. They have three great standards on cyber executive risk. And we actually had the opportunity to give feedback on a couple of those, discussing risk appetite and how you define that. That's a great standard for an organization that does risk assessments regularly. I'd never recommend
Exactly.
that to an organization that is, starting its journey in cybersecurity now. It would just be overwhelming. That's it in terms of questions. Biljana, I just want to thank you for being here, talking to us about ISO 27002. Really appreciate you taking the time. Time flies when you're having fun. We actually planned for an hour and we're just over an hour and 20, but that's not because, we wanted to cover basically all the different sections that we have here. For our audience in the chat and also those that have joined us on the YouTube live event, thank you for joining. For those that are going to see this later on, thank you for being witness to this update. We are going to link with materials at the bottom of this YouTube video, so you're able to access any of the information that we talked about here. And if there's nothing further from the chat, I'm just checking quickly. No, we don't have any more questions. Thank you again, and